What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the BlockHash podcast, your number one resource for all that is happening across the emerging tech space. So be sure to like, comment, and subscribe wherever you listen to or watch the show. Today, I'm joined by Unique Divine, co-founder of Nibiru, a secure smart contract platform addressing decentralization, security, and scalability through superior throughput, instant finality, and advanced parallel processing capabilities. We're going to learn about Nibiru today and what their ecosystem is like and what's happening for them here in 2025. Unique, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on. How you doing?
Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having me.
Likewise, pleasure's all mine. I guess the best way to start is would love to learn a little bit more about your backstory and how you got into the Web3 world. I know that you come from a little bit of a math, physics background, a little bit of AI as well. So you definitely have a lot of science and STEM in your past. So how did you kind of start from there, and how did that eventually lead to Web3?
Yeah, I studied primarily physics and CS at Columbia University in New York City. And so I was working on astrophysics research on black holes and large galaxies, basically, that got me into computer science. So basically, the thing there was at this point, this would be a couple of years back now. So it's like before LLMs took off, but definitely still the space for AI was pretty hot. And I was working on gravitational lensing. So that's essentially this effect where the bending of light from distant objects as it passes near massive bodies, well, basically, gravity distorts space time. And so you can compute a lot of the parameters around that with computer vision techniques and AI models. And so I started working on that as part of a National Science Foundation like grant where you go and do research with the PhD students for the whole summer, and learned like TensorFlow and started getting into PyTorch and ML. And that was where there was like a bigger shift for me from being more of like a physicist and mathematician to more working with technology and coding all day. So I caught the machine learning bug from there, and then worked as like an AI engineer at startups, both like on the applied and research side. And but at this point, I'm like pretty crypto native. So I started working on the Sommelier Protocol as the first main thing in blockchain, through a referral from a friend that was working on it as well, and then was making on-chain trading strategies. So that got me really familiar with like ETH DeFi. So I was using things like Uniswap v3, Aave, um, solidly on Phantom. So a lot of that stuff. And yeah, I guess the rest is history. So Nibiru started the following year after that.
Was Nibiru started by you and a friend, you and a colleague, or what was the inception of that kind of like?
Yeah, initially it was me and Zemp Sanka, like starting, and then met most of the other people that we brought on either super early to call, have as other co-founders, or, eventually got to like raising capital and stuff. But it started very organically out of I think the 2021 Cosmoverse was where we met each other. So he was working on some stuff on Thorchain and another project. And then at that time, I was working still on Som primarily. And yeah, basically, you just going back and forth on ideas, got pretty excited about a project involving stuff with like derivatives. And we found like, okay, we need to probably build different components into the base layer if we want to be able to make this app that we're working on. And so the initial motivations are a bit different from like what you see today, but yeah, that was how we got together.
What would you say really comprises the core mission for Nibiru? Like, what are the problems that you guys are trying to solve as Now One blockchain? What makes you guys different?
One, I guess, is the scalability problem in blockchain. So for years, like the blockchain world has always it's been chasing scalability with like more layers, like roll up, side chains, bridges. So one thing is really making sure that we're collapsing them instead of creating new layers, right? So one of the things Nibiru is doing as a primary uh, like feature in the architecture is unifying different VMs that usually would be like all separate chains or require a lot of cross-chain infrastructure to run, but have them all run at the base layer. Um, so in our case, it starts with like WASM and EVM. Um, and then the other aspect of it is really putting a big emphasis on like making that performance scalable, or at the point where people can build things that rival like a centralized exchange or something like Hyperliquid, right? So a lot of L1 support speculation, but don't actually scale to support real usage. Um, like if you want to run a trading platform with above like a 2-second latency, arbitrage bots are going to eat you alive. Or if you want to build a social app where you have likes and comments, like you use in Web2, or like even RWAs where you need deterministic low latency settlement, where if you can't guarantee the timing or if things are too slow, you're not going to be able to build a sort of trust and like bring on the level of capital that people want to see in the Web3 world. So I think one of the key things we're addressing, I guess, is making sure you can handle interactive state-heavy apps, because otherwise devs either build centralized backends or they leave, right? Yeah, so that would be like the core. But to kind of summarize, I guess, all of the things, and I'm sure we'll probably get into more of this later on in the talk, is multi-VM, which I touched on, essentially means that devs can ship fast, because then they don't need to edit a lot of their code if they were working on another chain to set something up on Nibiru or to couple with an app that's on Nibiru. And then the other is parallelizing like the consensus part of the chain and execution side, and then also making it that you can handle high contention environments with a what we released in a paper recently called Nibiru Adaptive Execution. So yeah, so performance obviously isn't the whole reason to pick a chain, but without making that a big emphasis, there's not a big rationale to pick a new chain over one of the incumbents like Ethereum or Solana.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I want to dive into that a little bit more and ask about the ecosystem as well as some of the architecture underneath Nibiru as well. But wanted to also ask real quick, because I know that you guys announced something called the Nibiru Block Party just a few days ago. And wanted to see if you could expand on that a little bit and what's that going to entail? What's that going to look like? It sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, so Nibiru Block Party is what we've named a points program that we started or is to start pretty soon in the summer. And basically that rewards users with Aura, which is just a name for the system of tracking your participation using the Nibiru ecosystem, and particularly on the EVM side, because that's what we added in one of our latest mainnet upgrades, V2. So Aura reflects contributions when you're doing things like swaps, providing liquidity, lending. We're also working with Galaxy to have like quests. And so the point there is to like help fuel the network's growth with productive capital, but also to make sure that it's not just a campaign that incentivizes mercenary liquidity. So we're using a different metric than what you see in a lot of things, which is like, I guess you could say time-weighted TVL, right? So for a lot of the things where you act as an LP, sometimes you'll see chains or apps do a campaign where you get paid a certain percent APY or something for putting liquidity into it. And then what happens right as soon as the campaign ends in a month or two is people withdraw everything, right? So that's not really moving the needle. So when it's looking at in this case is you run things in seasons so that you have like a recurring, sort of gamification layer to it. And instead of doing just one snapshot, you kind of snapshot recurring like throughout all the time. And so you're looking at not just are people using, what's the usage on like one given day if you get lucky, but rather just, are you kind of like a loyal user that's like coming back to the platform and trying to identify those people. And then of course, if you're doing longer locks, longer liquidity positions, then there's boosts there. So the big thing there is it's like the way it's structured is very protected against like Sybil attacks or mercenary liquidity. So that should be good to reward like a lot of, like loyal users that you want to keep around.
To dive back into the technical parts about Nibiru, I want to ask about the architecture first, and then I think this would lead into the ecosystem pretty well. But there's a lot of older chains, that are hitting these ceilings per se when it comes to scaling and throughput and being able to handle a lot of complex activity from a lot of more complex applications on chain these days. So I'm curious, what Nibiru is doing maybe differently under the hood to handle some of those more complex applications and the more heavy on-chain activity.
Yeah, so one I touched on was having a novel multi-VM architecture. So that means when you're using, for example, the EVM RPC, there's EVM equivalents, right? It feels normal as if you're using a layer 2 or using Ethereum itself. But then if you're using a different one, they interoperate on the same chain and like couple together well. So how to actually get the performance, I touched on a bit in the previous question, but I'll expand on that now. So the one is parallel optimistic execution. So essentially, that's typically you have uh, in the process of like executing state transitions to put a new block on a blockchain, you have one side of it which is given some block, which basically just describes transactions or just state transitions, actually processing it, with the node software and then getting the new block result. The other side is communicating with all the other nodes to agree on which blocks to process, right? So that those would be execution and consensus. So one thing you can do is actually typically networks wait until consensus is finished, i.e., the block is finalized before they start executing to produce the new state. Um, they added a thing to they added a new functionality onto Comet BFT where you can look at unconfirmed blocks, and so by extension, you can add a feature where uh, it turns out that most of the time the unconfirmed block that's passed around in the network ends up being the one that's going to get finalized in consensus. So if you just start computing the state like preemptively, you squeak out like almost a 2x performance boost. So essentially, you overlap consensus and execution some instead of waiting for one to finish to start the next one. That's one. The other is Nibiru adaptive execution. So this one is not live on mainnet yet, but we developed and fleshed it out. It's essentially uh, looking at just on the execution side. Typically, the two strategies are um, optimistic and deterministic, i.e., you look at all the transactions, see if they're going to conflict, and see if you can run them in parallel, and then perform an update. With this strategy, instead, it's taking inspiration from Pair. It's called pipeline aware reordered execution. So this is research from HFT. They have for looking at a hybrid approach where you can uh, instead of going between the two extremes, look at like when you're going to have conflicts, dynamically monitor them at runtime so that you can still run most things in parallel. And then whenever you detect two things where you need to run them in serial, you then they slow down as like the normal case of running a block. So essentially, run everything in parallel. When you detect a conflict, instead of rolling back the whole state, only recompute the parts that have a conflict. Would be like the simplest way to explain that. And then of course, we're also doing like base layer improvements on the consensus side too. So we cover those in under the umbrella term Nibiru BFT, and those essentially it's an extension of what's already in Comet BFT, or kind of like a rewrite, but it'll be feature wise rather than destroying the whole thing because there's a lot of good stuff already in Comet BFT. Um, but yeah, those would be like in terms of the technical base layer improvements, like why some of the main reasons it gets like a lot of performance. So with that, you're getting well up into the tens of thousands of TPS, and not just like nonsensical ones where there's like one node, but actually with like scaling the network.
With some of that stuff in mind, and the different multifaceted approaches here you have towards kind of solving that with Nibiru, what type of applications are you seeing kind of take advantage of the platform that are being deployed? Are those mostly DeFi? Are those gaming? Are those NFT based? What is there like a theme kind of towards like what is being developed thus far?
Yeah, as is pretty natural for new ecosystems, many of the apps are on Nibiru or DeFi ones, but definitely they seem to be DeFi with a more specific philosophy, right? So our team is really interested in a lot in apps that have real economic activity or sustainable organic yield as as opposed to working on like inflationary incentives. So we are seeing like a pickup in activity for like structured products and like different forms of getting yield generation. So of course there's I don't know if you follow that sort of space, but there's a lot of projects that make like tokenized T-bills. Um, some are doing on-chain corporate credit, and basically there's a big potential for people to have uh, yield classes that stay within the same asset, right? Like you put in Bitcoin, you get yield in Bitcoin. You put in stables, you get yield in stables, which aren't obviously they might not seem as sexy in terms of an on paper APY number, but they're legit, and you're not like at risk of losing a bunch of capital for using those. So at first, with starting on the EVM, the earliest projects that have like gotten deployed on mainnet so far was two prediction markets, BRKT, pronounced bracket, and PRDT. We're using Stargate and Layer Zero for bridging, and then there's Oku did a Uniswap deployment. There's a couple other dexes, there's lending platforms, and then you actually touched on. Oh, we do have like an NFT marketplace through Element that launched as well, and a lot of this is going to be a part of that block party campaign that I touched on earlier. Um, but yeah, so practically speaking, though, um, a theme I guess you would say is yeah, passive yield products that don't carry as much risk for holding volatile assets. So when we look at like app strategy, we're really looking at making sure that people don't have to have high volatility exposure to on something to use the app. So one of the key things people will use, I think, is abracadabra via cauldrons. So cauldrons, for those that aren't familiar, is their name for isolated lending markets where you can lend up to some LTV and borrow MIM against it. So the cool thing there is it enables people to do like looping, right? Because you could essentially then have the deposit asset be a yield bearing token, borrow MIM, buy more of the yield bearing token, and keep like cycling that to get more yield. But the other thing there is like that couples well with basically any asset that uh, essentially you deposit and you can like passively hold to accrue yield. It fits in with like that on-chain corporate credit, T-bills, and even in our case, we have a native application called Psi. So Psi is a perps application, um, kind of similar along the style of like a GMX, right? Where the LP pools, like instead of GLP, you have SLP. And so those tokens are again another interest bearing asset. So we want to tightly couple like what you can do between like liquid staking applications, lending apps, and then any interest bearing apps that are launching on the chain. So that instead of having like um, stuff that people just farm, you have a lot of apps that are kind of like nice to, enticing for people to use.
Yeah, there seems to be a growing trend with yield bearing assets in the space. Because I've interviewed quite a few different projects already, kind of trying to do stuff like that, where they're wrapping like T bills and bonds and equities and real estate, like all this RWA tokenization stuff, but trying to put a yield bearing spin on it. Talking to the Canton Network in a week or two as well, they're also doing something with a platform they have called Digital Asset. So it definitely seems to be kind of like a trend right now in the space. But that's the theme that you guys kind of want to try and instill into Nibiru, right? Is kind of along those lines of um, the liquid staking, yield bearing type of applications.
Yeah, for sure. And then of course, like I touched on perps as well. Like derivatives have like maybe the most product market fit of like the decentralized like or DEX products besides just like a normal, besides just Uniswap and Aave. And so those are going to be pretty key too because they're self-sustaining. Like a lot of products in Web3 don't create sustainable economies, but those sort of apps do.
Yeah, absolutely. And what else is on the horizon for you guys and for Nibiru here this year? Do you guys have any other launches or announcements coming up? Other than the Nibiru block party, what else might be on the roadmap that would be interesting for users, those that are in the ecosystem, as well as maybe those that are developing applications and looking to launch as well?
Yeah, I mean the biggest thing was we started our mainnet last year, and then the biggest push was to get to V2. And so that brought the Nibiru EVM. And so a lot of that, although the upgrade is first deployed like in February, a couple months ago, um, getting a lineup of apps to get ready to launch is happening. If they didn't deploy over the last few weeks, it's essentially in the next 1 to 2 months. So that's bringing to life some of the stuff I touched on earlier in the talk, but then also um, really bringing to life a lot of what we described in the narrative for multi-VM is now you'll actually have apps that are maybe they're developed in another ecosystem or they were coded in Rust, but you can use them as a fully, with your Coinbase wallet or with a Google sign-in or MetaMask. Um, so the biggest thing would just be looking at new app launches that are coming up, especially over the next few months on the chain. And then the campaign is a way to help people know about it, help like have quests for that, and then just drive additional usage to them. But yeah, it's really coming to try out the EVM with like wallets you're familiar with.
Awesome. Are you guys been doing anything IRL this year? Any events, conferences, engagements, anywhere where people can kind of meet you guys in person?
Yeah, we tend to about I know in my case, I'm in the US, like about half of the team is North America, and then we sometimes go to the conferences in Asia. So yeah, we're pretty lean, so we're not traveling like a huge amount, but all the major stuff, right? Korea Blockchain Week, like stuff in Singapore, we tend to be at.
No, that's awesome, man. Definitely keep me updated on if you guys are going to be at any events, later this year. I'm going to be at Permissionless in a couple weeks in Brooklyn, and I'll be at Money 2020 in Vegas in the fall, and maybe a couple other things. It'd be great to maybe do an in-person interview as well, maybe dive into some more stuff within your guys' ecosystem as more of it continues to develop out and comes to light.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we'll
Um,
definitely get connected on that.
Yeah, where can people go to learn more about Nibiru? Is the website the best place to start? Do you guys have socials? Do you have a community, Telegram, Discord? Where should people go?
Yeah, so just what you touched on. So the most active communities are Discord and Telegram. All the links technically are on the website. So that's nibiru.fi. But we use similar handles for everything else. So the uh, on X, it's Nibiru chain is a handle. And then, yeah, we link to everything everywhere. So it's probably easy to find the others.
Okay, cool. And then if anyone wants to connect with you, are you on like LinkedIn or X or anywhere people can get in contact?
Yep. So I use X more often, but I'm on both platforms. And then it's my last name, so Divine, and then Nibiru. So Nibiru with an N at the end is the handle.
Awesome. We'll put all the links in the description below so people can easily find everything. Unique Divine, again, love the name. Appreciate you taking the time to come on today and discuss what you guys are doing with Nibiru. I think you guys have an awesome platform here and excited to see how you guys continue to develop out your ecosystem. And again, keep me updated and let's do this again soon.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Likewise. Take care.